to advance your career and salary. I'm Jeff Oxendine, and I'm the founder and president of My Health Career Navigator. Also joining me is Olivia Shorter from our team, and we are excited about this webinar. We created it based on feedback from Health Career Connection alumni at our annual alumni conference, that this would be a topic that would really be helpful to people who are both starting out their careers, or negotiating internship salaries, or people who are more mid-career and trying to see how they can advance and get promotions and salary increases and those kinds of things. So what we're going to do tonight, next slide, is to talk about the following things. First of all, why is negotiation important at all? Secondly, what are some of the principles and processes that you can use? What are some of the tactics that people may use when you're negotiating with them and that you can use? What are some of the key things about compensation negotiations? And then answer your questions. And I know some of you have submitted questions already, and Olivia will share some of those when we start out our discussion. I also want to welcome the Health Career Connection alums and thank you for the idea and thanks for joining us. So with that, I'm going to focus on why is negotiation important for health leaders. I think that in my own experience as a health executive and public health leader, and now somebody who's in an academic setting, and from our feedback from health employers, all the time that we get that negotiation is really a fundamental skill, and it's something that you have to do and you have to become good at. I first experienced this, and I, by the way, was the world's worst negotiator when I came out of my graduate program, and I was petrified of negotiation. I was really not good at it. I would freeze up. I would stumble all over my words. I would give in, in all my negotiations. And I realized, though, that all day that's what I was going to be doing. I was going to be negotiating with people that come in and ask for resources. I was a hospital administrator, and every meeting somebody would ask for additional resources or a new piece of equipment or a new program or a raise or something. And I found that my entire day I was negotiating, and I felt I had to get good at it. And so I really studied hard through CDs and workshops and courses and things like that, and I practiced, and I made a lot of mistakes, but I learned from those mistakes. And by the time I left being a health executive to come here to Berkeley, I would say that people would say that being a good negotiator was probably one of my top strengths. So I'm living proof that you can learn to negotiate and become a good negotiator, and that you can enjoy it, and that you can get what you want. Because one of the things that's an issue about negotiation is that you get what you negotiate, not what you deserve. And that's an important thing if you're negotiating on behalf of your organization, because if you're in an organization these days, or a community-based organization, or a health department, any kind of organization, you need to make your limited resources go further. And so by negotiating well, you're making those resources go further, and it helps you achieve your objectives. And a lot of people are better at negotiating on behalf of others than they are at negotiating on behalf of themselves. So you also have to make sure that you're good at negotiating for yourself. This will also come in handy not only in the professional space, but it will come in handy in the personal side of things. You will be negotiating for people to take pictures at your wedding, and you'll be negotiating for people to do remodels on your house. You'll be negotiating for cars. And in my case now, I have to negotiate with my 12-year-old son, who is the toughest negotiator that I have to deal with. And so, anyway, negotiation is an important life and professional skill. Next slide, please. So, one thing that's really not talked enough about around negotiation is that preparation is essential. And most people think of a negotiation as the time when you're actually in a meeting, negotiating with somebody, or trading emails, negotiating with them, the actual transactional part of it. But to be a good negotiator and to get what you want, you've got to be good at the preparation part of it. If you think of an iceberg, then the actual negotiating session is the tip of the iceberg. The remainder of the iceberg is where all you need to do that well. So some of the things you have to think about as you prepare and as part of the context for negotiating are how important are the relationships, and because there's always a dynamic between the relationship, resulting relationship from negotiation and getting what you want. And sometimes if it's a relationship with your new boss or a new community funder or something like that, you've got to really consider the importance of and balance those two things. If you're negotiating for a used car from somebody that you're never going to see again, then the relationship isn't as important and you can focus more on what you want. It's an important thing to know. Most of the time there's history that's taken place and there are some current dynamics that are part of the context of your negotiation. And it's important to understand, how has your organization negotiated before with that particular player, and are there some current issues, or how have you done in terms of negotiating for your compensation in previous negotiations with other companies and with your current company, and how were you hired, what were the promises, those kinds of things. Important to decide what's at stake and how important that is, and how important the outcome is to you. Sometimes if some people are very competitive, they want to win at every single negotiation, that's a big thing for them. But sometimes what's at stake is very small, and it might be something that the big picture you'd rather give in, and it's not such a big deal to get what you want versus the relationship or just in general. Sometimes what's at stake could be your company or your job or your salary that's feeding your family. So you got to think about those things. It's important to know what's your usual conflict resolution mode. Are you somebody who tends to be really competitive? And I've had some surgeons in my negotiation class at UC Berkeley, for example, who are extremely competitive and they want to win. Their approach is to be really assertive and win at all costs. And then there are a lot of people who their tendency is to default is to give in and to cave and to want to please people, and there's no right or wrong answer. You just have to know what your default resolution mode is, and then what is really needed in that situation, and be able to try on a new mode if that's not your typical mode. And then a big thing to do is to sort of understand, how is success going to be defined? And most people don't do that, so it's really important to define what is success to you. And then there's also something called a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you want to say, ideally for me, success is defined in this way. If I get to keep my job with my, that I really like, working with this organization, continue to get really good experience and mentorship and growth and those kinds of things, and I want to get, at least X percent, at least a 7% increase or something like that. And, if that's the case, that's success. But you have to define that up front, because then that's the filter for your choices. A BATNA is something that is, well, if I don't get this 7% and stick with my job, then my best alternative to a negotiated agreement that gets me what I want is something else. It's to stay in my job and then look for another job over the next year and then move on, or to just stay in my job and say I'm getting great experience, I'm going to continue to stay, but I'm going to ask again next year for a raise, or to leave. Your best alternative to getting a negotiated agreement might be to leave. So having your success defined as well as your BATNA gives you the ability to negotiate and be more free in your negotiation, because you have an alternative if it doesn't work out. Next slide, please. So one of the things I'm going to encourage you to consider is interest-based negotiation. Many negotiations are positional negotiations, and this approach comes from the Harvard Negotiation Project, which is a good thing to read about if you. It's a great resource for information on negotiation. But if you look at the pyramid, most people end up arguing over positions rather than really taking the time to understand what are somebody's interests and what are the values and the needs that underlie those interests. And if you can understand those other things, it gives you a lot more to understand where people are coming from, and gives you the potential creativity to think about other ways to have a win-win solution to help them meet their interests and their values. There are a lot of other ways to meet people's interests and needs than maybe the position that they're taking. And so that's what you want to do, you want to become an interest-based negotiator, realizing that there are times when you will be more of a positional negotiator, and even interest-based negotiations often come down to positional distribution of resources. But you want to take the interest-based approach. Next slide, please. And just in a sort of a side-by-side look at this, is the traditional interest-based approach, is that scenario where you are in more of an adversarial position where somebody's trying to win at the expense of somebody else. It's about concessions and applying pressure and leverage and kind of looking for a one-sided win. And many of you have probably had that negotiation. Certainly negotiating for a car is in that particular way. And sometimes salary negotiations or contract negotiations with unions or something may feel that way. There are also the interest-based approach is like we're approaching the situation as joint problem solvers with our goal is that we're going to end up with a deal that we are happy with, that meets our interests and is fair if you were to look at the principles accordingly. It's about increasing the pie or coming up with new ways to meet each other's needs and interests and seeking a win-win. There are a lot of negotiations that are kind of in between here, as I mentioned, that you start out saying we want to find a way for a win-win solution, and you end up with a little bit more positional at the end because resources are tight and leverage is a big factor in healthcare negotiations. But I'm going to encourage you to come at it from the joint problem-solving perspective and then have the ability to do the positional negotiation when you need to. Next slide, please. And so some key considerations are, first of all, we already talked about this, getting what you want versus the resulting relationship. And I'm always very mindful, and I have a filter that kind of goes through my head for the most part before I respond, particularly if you're triggered by something or if you don't like what somebody's presenting. You always have to step back and think of some of these kinds of things in a mindful way, and then you can decide after you've taken a deep breath and after you've had time to think about it what you want to do. One big thing is don't be afraid to ask for what you want and what you need. When I grew up, I grew up with a wonderful family, but the messages I got from my parents were, oh, you don't ask, for things. It's bad, it would be judgmental if I were to ask for things, either at home or with people that I would go visit or something like that. And I've learned that it's really, if you don't ask, then the answer is for sure no. Versus if you ask, the answer might be yes, and you never know what might be possible. Had an example the other day of an HCC alum who got admitted to a great school, public health, and she was going for spring visit day. And I said, did you ask if they were going to pay for your travel to come to spring visit day to look at the school? And she said, oh, no, I just assumed I was going to have to pay. Well, sure enough, she went back and asked, and they said, oh, of course we have funding, for you. And they provided her with some funding to be able to do that. So that meant hundreds of dollars for her. So it never hurts to ask in a non-entitled, non-arrogant way, but for what you want. And that includes salary increases and promotions and those kind of things. Another thing to think about is how attached are you to a particular the thing you're negotiating for. Because it may be that you really, in the end, your definition of success is that you really want to get that thing. You're very attached to it, or your significant other is, or your company is, and you don't really have the opportunity to walk away. And if that's the case, you're in a different kind of negotiating position than you are if you really aren't that attached and you can walk away. So, for example, my wife and I put in an offer on a house around the corner from us a few years ago. It was the house, our dream house, and we thought, oh my gosh, if it ever comes available, we have to get this house. And it came available, and we were so excited, and we put in an offer, and they came back and they said, well, no, we need a lot more, and they had all these conditions. And so our BATNA, our best alternative to a negotiated agreement, was to stay in our current house. We were happy with it. We'd be fine living there. And we decided that we were not that attached to having that new house. And so we ended up not countering the offer, which ended up being a tremendous thing because the housing market dropped the next month, and the value of the house plummeted by a significant amount that we would have been stuck with that. But if we were really, there might have been a situation where we said, you know what, we really want this. So you just have to be mindful of that. One thing you want to work on, and this is important for your salary increases, for your salary negotiations, is to come up with the most justifiable, aggressive position that you can make. And this comes from agent Lee Steinberg, a very famous sports agent who came from UC Berkeley, the first one actually. And this is where you do your homework on what is my value. So if it's your salary, you've done your homework to say, this is what other people who graduated from my program are getting paid. This is what your organization shows as the salary range for the position. Here's what the other people who you've hired have gotten paid. I've spoken to them to find out, what they've gotten paid. Here's what I got paid in my previous job, and so you want to develop a position that allows you to say, this is what I should be paid, and based on the homework and the case that you've made to be able to do that. The last three things are really important. You have to develop relationships and the integrity as a negotiator in advance. This kind of interest-based approach to negotiation is more of one that is based on building a good relationship and a connection with the other person and understanding their needs and interests. But in the health field, a lot of these negotiations are with funders, are with vendors, are with doctors in your own organization or staff members. You want to develop a good relationship and integrity so when the time comes to negotiate, you've got a relationship there. You've got integrity. When you say to them, this is all I can afford to pay, that they believe you rather than think that you're just negotiating with them in a way that is unfair. The last few things most healthcare negotiations unfortunately these days come down to leverage. Leverage means that you have some ability to really influence the outcome of the negotiation, or that they have to have you. The same thing could happen when you have a job offer and it's been a difficult to fill position. Part of your homework is to find out how long have they been trying to fill that position. If this is a position that they've been trying to fill for 6 or 9 months or a year, and you're finally the right person that they found, you have some leverage in that negotiation because they don't have an alternative. So you having an alternative and them not having an alternative is one example of leverage. And you must be able to walk away in the end. If you have to use your leverage, the ability to walk away is the ultimate leverage that you can use. Because if you can walk away, then that makes them have to decide, do I really want to change my position to get this person, or am I okay with walking away too? So walking away calls the question. Next slide, please. Some other things. Some of you out there are all about getting a good deal. I have a good friend who's like that. He's like, well, Jeff, look at this great deal that I got. And I'm like, is that something you want? And he's like, well, no, but it's a great deal, so I couldn't pass it up. And so you have to sometimes be mindful of, are you really getting what you want? Or are you just getting a good deal? And the next a couple things are about really thinking about people's interests and values and being creative, genuinely caring about them getting their needs and interests met, but within your constraints, and so that you still get what you're looking for, and creating options. Think of more things at the table. People want concessions, it's because they know in a negotiation there is some give and take, and it's nice to be able to get some concessions because you think the other person is working with you. So plan to give some concessions, and set up your offers to people or your asks so that you can give concessions. And people want to feel good about the outcome. You'll see a lot of times in a sale around a car or a negotiation, people will shake your hand and they'll say, you did a really great job. That was a tough negotiation. And they're doing that because there's something called, sometimes they really mean it, and sometimes it's to avoid something called buyer's remorse. Because if you go away thinking, well, maybe I got taken advantage of, you can always go back and not sign the agreement or not buy the car or something like that. So, and then I think this last one's really important. Have a genuine interest in the other party's goals and their constraints, and really try to make it work for them. There's one really important negotiation I was a part of many years ago as a health executive between physician groups, and we tried so hard to meet the other party's goals and constraints, and the other party really disrespected us. They would make a negotiation appointment 3 weeks in advance. They wouldn't then they would cancel or they would show up 2 hours late. They wouldn't have done any preparation. They would never change their position. And so finally we actually gave them a termination notice. We walked away, and they didn't have any alternatives, and they had to come to, we didn't want to do that, but we were just tired of them not having a genuine interest in working with us. So anyway, these are considerations. Next slide. So now let's talk quickly about the process of negotiation, and then we'll get into some tactics and some salary negotiation specifics. So next slide, please. This is a process I've come up with that I encourage you to think about and to use in your negotiation. So the first three things here are preparation, assessing what those things. How attached am I? How important is this to me? What is my leverage? What is my BATNA? What are my tendencies? So first of all, is really assessing yourself and actually beginning to assess the other party that you're negotiating with as well. Learning as much about them as you can and their tendencies and their the way that they operate. The second is strengthening your own readiness and position. So if you know you're going to be negotiating, you want to be able to do your homework so that when you go in and talk to them, you have justified your position. Sometimes there's internal negotiation you have to do within organizations. You've got to get the organization to agree with the position you want to make, or you've got to get your significant other to agree with what you want to propose. So there's sort of developing and strengthening your readiness and your position. Going to a good graduate program in public health, or a strong business school, or a strong medical school, that strengthens your readiness also and your positioning. Then there's the preparation for the negotiation. A lot of things we've already talked about. I've invented this next term called the first encounter, which means when you go into a negotiation with somebody, don't have the pressure to make a deal the first time, unless you have a time deadline, which sometimes you do have, and you don't have the time to have a first encounter. But even then, you can have a first encounter in the morning, and then you can call them back later in the afternoon. And the first encounter is a situation in which you're going there to listen and to learn about their interests and their values and their positions and their needs. And you're sharing a little bit about yours, but you're mainly there to learn about the other person, also to learn about their style, to establish a relationship and a connection, and to really set up a positive negotiation. Or to prepare yourself for what could happen. One quick example for me is I was negotiating as a consultant on behalf of a group of doctors many years ago, and I went to meet with a hospital administrator. And the hospital administrator, within 2 minutes, started insulting me and yelling at me. And basically I was like, okay, this is very interesting. And fortunately, it was the first encounter, and I wasn't trying to make a deal, and I wasn't trying to be on my best. But I walked away from that encounter knowing this guy is a yeller, and I confirmed that with some of the doctors that I worked with. So the next time I was prepared. I was prepared that he was going to yell, which he did, and he insult me, which he did. And I didn't faze me, and I actually purposely triggered him a couple times to get him to do things that I wanted, and I brought along one of the physicians with me so that the dynamic would be different. So that's an example in a sort of an extreme way of a first encounter. Other people, you might just learn that they talk a lot, or that they are silent, or that they are confrontational, or that or you just learn good things about what their needs are, so you can come back with a great proposal. After you have that first encounter, you go away, you refine your strategy, you come up with a new proposal based on that great information that you've learned and a new approach, right? Then you do some follow-ups, you end up summarizing the deal, you have to close the deal. Those deals don't get done without people signing a letter or signing a contract, and sometimes just a verbal, hey, we've made a deal, that doesn't do it. You've got to close the deal. And once you have a deal, you got to start preparing for the next time around. So that's a process I'd throw out to you, and you can use that to help in your preparation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, if you're still there. So by having a process and by doing the preparation work, it will help you to be able to really be prepared. Now, I mentioned Lee Seinberg earlier, who basically, I learned a lot about negotiation from reading his book, Winning with Integrity. And those of you who like sports and sports examples would like this particular book, although it's a little bit dated now. But these are some of the rules of negotiation I learned with him. And some of the things are important, you know, if you can align yourself with people who share your values and your interests and those things. And in public health and healthcare, there's often good people that you can align your values with when you're negotiating. And that changes the tone somewhat. But if it's somebody who really doesn't share the same values, it can be a tougher, and you may or may not decide you want to work with them going forward. Learn all you can about the other party before the negotiation. That's part of the preparation piece of it. Talk to other people who've negotiated with them. Talk to, as much as you can find out about them, also what their interests are, where they went to school, are they alum of the same school that you went to? Yesterday, Olivia and I had a call with somebody, and right before the meeting, somebody sent me a profile of the person we were going to be talking to, and it mentioned that she went to a couple of different colleges and that she was from a certain community. So I was able, in our negotiation, to mention those particular schools and to kind of take an angle that I knew was useful to her. Convincing the other party that you have an option is really important, because if you have an option, then they think that you might walk away, and that makes them immediately have to consider how to deal with you best. The house example I gave earlier, my wife and I, right when we were going to make the offer for the house, the real estate agent for the selling party said, oh, by the way, another family just came in to look at the house earlier this morning, and I think they might be putting in an offer too, just like you are. So that really made us have to think, is that person just making that up, or do we have to really have a higher offer as a result? To check and balance yourself, you want to set your limits before the negotiation begins, that you won't go above a certain amount so that you don't get carried away, to go beyond your means. Sometimes you can go above your limit, but at least know what the limit is beforehand. These next two things are kind of self-evident. Next slide, please. I think we're having some technical, the slides are tired, it's in the afternoon here. These next two are two of the most important things. Learn to listen. I would say my best skill as a negotiator is listening to the other party. Through listening is where you hear what their interests are, what their needs are. You hear clues about what they really want or what they can and cannot do. And listening is both auditory listening and listening to their body language and those kinds of things, and really try to spend more time listening. And there's a lot of pressure in negotiation to feel like you have to talk all the time. You want to spend more time listening than talking. And being comfortable with silence is part of that. And a lot of people are not comfortable with silence, but when you're comfortable with silence, you can take time to think about how you want to respond in a situation rather than feeling like you have to respond right away. And B, you can use silence as a tactic to have the other party have to really think more about making a concession or giving away information. If somebody's really a talking person, if they're silenced, they will likely fill the space by giving more insights about their interests or about their positions, or they might make more concessions or something like that. Don't play split the difference. I would guess all of you probably had somebody say, oh, we're so close, let's go ahead and split the difference. And that's a very common thing that comes up all the time. But you have to look to see, usually the people who suggest that are the people that splitting the difference is a deal that's in their favor rather than yours. So you just have to be aware of that. And I think these other things are self-evident. Next slide, please. So these are some resources that you can use, and you can look at these through the webinar. But Getting to Yes from the Harvard Negotiation Project, they've had many more updated versions of that now. And what they don't teach at Harvard Business School, 2 classic books on negotiation. Next slide. So these are some tactics, and I'm not going to do all of these. I'm going to do some sample of these, and then we're going to talk about compensation and get your questions. So common ones that come up, particularly I'll talk about them with respect to compensation negotiation, is around higher authority, which is higher authority is I have to go back and check with the board. So I know you've made this proposal. Well, I have to go check with my boss, or if an HR recruiter, I've got to go back and check with the hiring manager. So that's, or in my case, I have to go check with my wife, who's the higher authority. And so you've got to be able to, it gives you a chance in the negotiation to go back to people and give some thought to what they're proposing first, and maybe do a little bit more homework or come up with a new proposal that really helps meet their needs. Or if you're uncomfortable with a position and you want to just kind of get out of the situation, you can say. You can also just say, I'm going to go think about it, which is fine too. But sometimes it's easier to say, I'm going to go talk to somebody else. And it also puts you out of the decision-making mode and kind of gives somebody else as the decision maker. Good cop, bad cop is something that comes up all the time. And it'll be the person who says, well, I really want you to have this deal. I'm working so hard for you, but gosh, it's my boss, or it's the used car manager or something who won't give me that deal. And so beware of good cop, bad cop that goes on. The nibble and add-on are things that you've all experienced when you go to Best Buy and you've got that new device that you wanted to get, and you walk out and you're all excited about it, and then they say, oh, would you like to buy that $200 insurance for a year on the electronic equipment? The same thing can happen in a negotiation, which would be, oh gosh, I really love that salary that you've come up with, but now can I also get an extra week of vacation? Or I assume this includes some reimbursement for this class I want to take, or something like that. Firmness is something that some people will use. They'll just say, I can just tell you that we're not going to be able to do that. And some people will do that all the time, and they're telling the truth, and some people it's just their approach. Realize that time is a factor in negotiation, so people will oftentimes wait until the last hour to make their concessions, and so if that's the case, you can either do that yourself and use time, or they'll use time in the salary negotiations, which I absolutely don't like, which is they'll say, well, you need to let me know by Monday if you're going to take this offer. And they're putting the time pressure on you to make an offer, to a decision, maybe when you're not ready. And so what you want to do there is push back to try to get yourself out of that time situation, to buy you enough time to make a good decision, and maybe to get some more options, and maybe to get some more information. We've already talked about being able to walk away and respecting the other party. So these are there's a lot of more detail to these, but given the time, I'm happy to answer any questions about these if you want during the question session. Next slide, please. One of the things that I think is a common thing is people now want to negotiate over email. And I maybe am old-fashioned, but I think if you can negotiate in person, or if you can negotiate on the phone by speaking to people, or by a web meeting or something, it has advantages, because you can hear what the people say. They can not misinterpret the tone that you have when you're getting something across, because in an email or a text, the tone can be misinterpreted, right? And tone is an important thing in negotiation. Or you might not have all the nuances that you want. You might not be able to develop the relationship in the way that, and appeal to their person. You can't listen, right? Via email or via text, you can't listen. And so other than you can read what they're writing, but you may not listen to all of the things. You might just get their positions rather than their interests and values. And so there are times when people are going to want to negotiate with you via email. I think if you can, at least the first parts and the first encounter and other things, do it in person or by phone or by web meeting or something. And and it's different when they're looking at your face and they're proposing things to you when they're not. And so I would encourage you to do that if you can. You can maybe do negotiations by email at the end if you're sending an initial proposal and saying, hey, just want you to review this in advance of our meeting. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Or if you're writing a summary of the meeting, here's what we agreed to. That's okay to do in writing. Get back to me if you have any questions, or reply to say that you approve this. But if you can, try to do negotiations in a non-electronic way, at least for part of it. Next slide, please. Negotiation can be uncomfortable, and so you want to end up with going in with this not being about your ego. That, oh my gosh, if I don't do well in this, I'm a bad person, or oh, I have to win because I'm much stronger, or whatever it is, or I have to get this big dollar amount, or else they really don't care about me, they don't value me. Enter your negotiation without having the outcome be tied to your ego. and be prepared about the other people to, identify your fears and play on those. And a good thing to do is just practice. If you are afraid, like the guy yelling at me, I had somebody practice yelling at me, so I was okay, with that. Or, talk about some of your fears, and because if you know what the worst case is, then you can kind of go, okay, well, if that's the worst case, I can live with that. I'll still be able to move on. If you have a partner, maybe sometimes if you're not the heavy and you need somebody who is the heavy, you bring somebody else who's comfortable with that to the negotiation. Or if you're too heavy, if you're too strong and you need somebody who's more mellow, and more agreeable, bring that person. Next slide. All right, now we're going to talk specifically about career advancement. So some of the things that come up around career advancement are being comfortable with asking for a promotion or asking for a raise. And those can be they can be uncomfortable things, and there can be a power differential because you're asking your supervisor or someone above you who may be in a position of power. You're afraid to offend them. You're afraid that they'll be upset with you, or if you don't like their offer, that they're going to take it out on you or something. But I think it's important to, first of all, really understand what is the typical situation, the typical scenario in your organization around when people get promotions and when they get raises, and know that going into it when you negotiate your deal, actually, because you want to know how long is it going to be before I have a chance to get a raise or an increase. And promotion might be a different thing because that's not always a predictable kind of thing. But for sure on a salary increase, when will it be? Well, I'll have my first salary review, and what's the policy about giving increases? And then you want to keep that in mind and say, okay, well, if they said it's every year, then it's okay to go to them and say, well, I've been here a year. We talked about that when I first came on board, that I was hoping to increase my salary, in a very humble, non-entitled way, to say, look, I'm really interested in now in talking about the salary increase that I think I've earned. Also earn it, and I've earned it by the things that I've done. And also the criteria for your job performance, understand what that is and be able to go back and say, look, I've been able to achieve all these things that we laid out that I was supposed to do, and so now I want to talk about a raise. And for a promotion, you might really get a lay of the land and find out, are they giving people promotions, or are they cutting budgets, or what's going on here, and be able to ask in an appropriate way. It doesn't mean it'll happen right away. You can just say, look, I just want to let you know I've been here for a while. I feel like it's time to talk about a promotion, and when is it a convenient time to talk about that, or is this a good time, or should we talk about it the next month, or whatever it is. But no, don't go in and say, unless you really have another alternative and you really are fed up and you're going to leave, I need a promotion, or I'm going to go now. Pound your fist. That may not be the best way to go about it. And also if you are looking at a new offer, you really want to think about how that new offer, the comprehensive part of that new offer, if it's within your organization or outside, how does that really compare? All the aspects of it related to not only your salary, but the benefits and the time off and your flexibility and the people that you work with, and really think hard about what's most important to you, not just winning the transaction, or not just fixating on getting a certain amount of money, but what's really most important to you overall, and how can you make that happen in the new situation, and how can you negotiate that for what you need in that situation. Particularly, it's helpful if you're already in a job and and your best alternative to negotiate an agreement is to stay in that job, and you let the people know that, I'm really excited about your role, but I am in a job that I'm happy with. As somebody told me this morning, I'm happy with my job, and I'm okay with staying there. But it's going to take X amount for me to make a change, because I'm interested, but this is what I need based on, and this is why I need that. Next slide, please. So when you think about negotiation, and by the way, I'm calling this compensation negotiation rather than salary negotiation, because compensation is a lot more than salary. Salary is one part of what determines how much you take in each month, or that you spend each month. So you really want to overall look at, when you're comparing particularly one offer to another, you want to look at what's the total amount that I'm going to bring in, and what's the total amount that I'm going to have to shell out. and make an overall comparison, because you can get a higher salary from somebody, but if you've got to pay a higher contribution of benefits, if you've got to pay for parking, if you've got to pay for your cell phone, if you've got to drive across the bridge or have a BART commute, if you've got, if you just think about all the things now that you have to do, and you want to look at the sum total of those, of those things. And so think about your overall compensation, not just the salary. And I have a list of, if you want to send me, I'll share with you of 31 things you can negotiate as a way to get you either more benefits or more flexibility or more income or less expense. And you want to, again, think about your fears, how strong is your attachment, what is your default approach, who are you negotiating with, and how are you going to make the case best with them? Are you negotiating with the recruitment manager, which may be one kind of negotiation, which the relationship doesn't matter as much, or are you negotiating with the hiring manager? And if you have exhausted your options with the recruiting manager, which I sometimes have done or seen people do, you'll say, you know what, if the hiring manager really wants you, which they would only do. By the way, you negotiate when you have an offer, not so much before. But you end up saying, can I talk to the hiring manager? Because I don't think we're getting anywhere. I have an alternative, but I really am still interested. Let me talk to the hiring manager, a decision maker, or somebody who's got a bigger picture on you than just the HR person here. You're one of the many people they're negotiating that day. Next slide, please. So some big issues are who throws out the first number. And there's two ways to look at this one. The general rule is that you don't want to be the first one to throw out a number, because what happens, and this happened to me early on in my career, which I suffered as a result of for many years, which is I threw out a number that was too low relative to what they were prepared to offer me. I had not done my homework to know how much that organization really could pay, and I was replacing somebody who ended up getting paid on the same job, and I didn't know that. But I threw out the first number. They said, "Whoa," and it was a lot more than what I was making at the time. It was what I'd be happy with, but they would have paid me a lot more. So that's one reason to not throw out the number. Another recent example, though, is when the person I was negotiating with, they did throw out the first number, and what they did was they did it to anchor the negotiation. So by throwing out a first number, they threw out kind of a low number, and that made it so that now I was negotiating up from there rather than at a much higher place where I thought that it should be, and it made me feel like, oh my gosh, what if I'm really being unreasonable here to go for the higher amount? This was for a project that I was working on. And so in that case, the person anchored the negotiation at a level they were happy with by throwing it out. Or you can anchor it at a number that you're happy with on a higher side. That was a lower side. You can throw a number on the higher side. If you have an alternative, and if you can, and you're happy with your best alternative, and it's basically like, well, hey, I'm going to go for it. If they'll take this offer, then I'll do it. Then throw in a high number after you've done your homework to make sure it's not too low. When somebody asks you directly about what salary your expectation is, one question is do you really, they'll say, can you tell me about your salary expectations? Or as somebody said to me last week, Jeff, can you tell me, what the salary is that you have in mind? And then you can always, you don't have to answer that one unless they've shared more information, unless you're ready. So one of my friends says you can be silent. You can go, oh, you're offering 50,000, and you can go, oh, 50,000, and then you cannot say anything. And they might either respond by by increasing it, or saying, well, hey, can we talk about it? And you can say, well, I need to step back and think about it. Or you can just say, well, I'm interested in a competitive salary. I need to learn more about the responsibilities for the position and what I'd be doing and what your salary range is and what the benefits are. You can always deflect. And also, if they ask you to fill in a salary on a sheet or something, you can also say, I want a competitive salary or to be determined or something like that. And sometimes I would not include my previous salary because I'd say it's not relevant. Unless you're going to the exact same position, you could say, this is not the relevant salary to me. I want to know about the salary in the new position. We already talked about what happens when somebody says, let me know by Monday if you're going to accept this offer. And that's situation, I would encourage you to try to push back. Sometimes if they have an alternative and they're willing to go for it, you might have to think about it and you want to negotiate a little bit more time. But I always would try to say, well, when I have some other offers coming in, or my advisor told me I need to negotiate, or I've got to talk to my wife and she's not available until Tuesday or Wednesday or a week later. If they want you when they've made an offer, which they do by indicating that, you can try to buy more time. Most of the time, people are able to do it. I had a student recently who was not, and she had to decide. So, and anyway, understand your alternatives and theirs, and realize, again, there's sometimes hard feelings, yours and theirs, about compensation. And one thing I will say is it's uncomfortable sometimes to negotiate for what you want, but it's more uncomfortable to have a lower salary and then you be unhappy about it and have less money for a long time than it is to have the discomfort of maybe asking for more than what you want. So think about that. Next slide. So what are your questions, or what's the situation that you're in? Hopefully this was helpful to you. This is quick. Negotiation, I teach a whole semester-long class on this. There are books written on it. There's a lot. So I would encourage you to become a good student of negotiation, to practice, and to don't be your own hardest critic about your ability. Do the best that you can. But what questions do you have?
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much. I'll be reading some of the questions that we have. I just want to remind everyone that you can send those to us using your chat box, and we'll be sure to get through as many as we can. If folks are listening in by phone, or if you called in by phone and you're able to email us, you can questions and you're not on the GoToWebinar platform, you can email them to myhcn1@gmail.com. But first, Jeff, the first question is there a common sort of starting point or an appropriate starting point when asking for an increase in salary or wage? Earlier you mentioned 7%. Is this common, or how would you recommend setting a starting point?
So it's a good question. I think that's part of the preparation, is if you can, and sometimes you can find out this by talking to HR or by hiring managers or something, does your organization have a policy about salary increases? Because there are some organizations, for example, that will say the most that you can get if you're moving from one level to another is a 10% increase, for example. That's some organizations I've worked with, that's the case, and they stick to that. Some organizations will have a policy like that, and they may or may not stick to it, or they may not give you the full 10% automatically. They may only give you a lower amount. But anyway, you want to find out, is there a policy? You want to find out, have other people gotten increases, and what kind of increase they did. You want to look at the level of additional responsibility that you're taking on, and to decide, is that how much significantly more is that than what your current role is, and in terms of budget, in terms of people, in terms of complexity. Those are things that are tied to to money in terms of the kind of problems that you're going to solve. And if you can, you want to make the case that you're going to be, your job, it requires higher level, your promotion does require a higher level skill than what you currently have, or what they're asking you to do requires more responsibility and those kind of things. If you're not changing jobs, if it's just an increase within your current position, you want to find out what level are they giving people this year in your organization. Is it based on performance? And if so, what are the different, like at UC Berkeley, we've had whopping 2 or 3% increases the last couple of years, even if you're a really strong performer. And so, you need to sort of understand what the lay of the land is, and then you need to sort of make the case for why you should be within or more than what they're offering. So I would start out by asking questions first and saying, gee, I'm just wondering, what you have in mind, to the hiring manager, and ask why. Usually a good question is always, well, why did you come up with that, and how did you come up with that, in a non-confrontational way. Then you listen to their thinking, and you can position yourself relative to that. Hopefully that's helpful.
We have a question that is really building on that as a follow-up. Do employees have a right to know the range of salary for that position in their organization? And is it appropriate to ask, whether that be HR or staff, to have access to that information in order to make, an informed decision and approach.
Yeah, and you're right. And knowing the whole range, one thing I should have said is to know what the range is and where you are in the range, to be able to then decide, and also know where you came in, ideally when you joined the organization, because if you came in at the lower end of the range, then you might have a case that and you've done a great job, and they put you at the lower end because they weren't sure yet how good of a job you do, then you could show, then you've done a great job. You can say, well, now you can see that I can do the job. I've done a great job. So now let's get me something closer to the midpoint of the range, which is what the organization often uses as what people that have been there for some period of time, and it's kind of, after an experienced person who's been there for a certain amount of time and done a good job should be at the midpoint within a certain period of time. And that's also something you should learn about. What's the philosophy of the organization about moving people in those ranges or amongst the range? I don't know whether you have a right to the salary range or not, but it is certainly something you should ask for when you're looking at a job, and when they make you an offer, you should say, well, what is the salary range? Because you want to know where you are in the range, you want to ask why you're in that range, and you want to also know what your upside is as well. So you should ask for it. If they didn't give it when you hired, you can ask for it for the new position you're looking at, or for your increase. I think you should ask for it, and you can ask HR, you can ask your hiring manager. Think of the best person. Develop good relationships with the HR people, because if they have a good relationship with you, they may be more likely to share something with you than not. So you should know that, and then you should know generally how they range. And then there's another issue, if you can, which is in how you relate to your peers that are within range, which that's harder to find out sometimes, although sometimes people will share salaries, and some organizations will show that. But if the range is a certain amount and you're above your peers already because you negotiated good when you came in, then that may be one, because they may say, well, you're already above your peers, we can only go so much more because there's a parity issue. Or if you're far below your peers for the same kind of job, then you might have a good position to be able to go, I'm far below all the other people who do the same job that I do, and I really want to be at equity or above them because of my performance and my commitment, etc.
Thanks, Jeff. Another question we have is really in response to a point you brought up earlier about opportunities to negotiate with your employer about covering tuition costs if you want to pursue graduate programs or coursework. How would you recommend starting that conversation? And do you have any advice there?
So, well, first of all, find out, does your company have a policy around tuition reimbursement or payment for professional development courses, or what is the policy and what is the practice? It's good to have policy and the practice around those kinds of things, just so you're informed, so that you're asking within the policy and within the practice, or you have a reason to ask beyond the policy and the practice, which you may do in your situation, particularly in a situation, for example, they say, oh, well, salary increases are frozen this year, and we're not going to be able to give you that increase that you were due. Then that might be a cause to say, well, but gosh, can I have a little bit more on the tuition reimbursement? There may be cases that in many big organizations they couldn't do anything about that beyond the policy. So I think it's good to know what the policies are, but it's also, I think, making the case. Hopefully you have a manager that cares about your professional development and your leadership development, and so all along, like, letting them know and showing that you are interested in those kinds of things. And then if you want to go to some kind of an event or a course or a conference or a degree or something, have been talking to them about it for a while. Like, I really want to improve my project management skills. I really want to improve my lean. I want to learn more about lean management. And hopefully it's something that's related to the job that you're doing, because then it makes it easier for them to go, yeah, we really need more people who are good at project management. So you getting that skill, I think you're ready for it. Let's go ahead and pay for you to get that certification. Or lean's going to be coming, so yeah, let's send you to that lean management course. Or, you know what, you've been here for 3 years now. You've really shown that you're committed to our organization, and you let them know, I see myself staying here, I want to become a supervisor, so maybe they'll help you pay for that degree and you're willing to commit to staying longer as a result of it. So I think understand your also knowing how to manage up, understanding your supervisor or the executive that you're talking to and what their perspective is on it. If somebody's really pro-professional development, that may be one thing. If they're really negative about it, it might be you have to work a little bit harder for the case that you're going to meet. So I guess that's my advice.
Thanks, Jeff. And we have two more questions, and if that's all right. And the
Yes.
next question is, what is the strategy if after all of this research and after coming up with a plan, your supervisor still says, we don't have the means to increase your salary or give you what you're looking for? What is appropriate next step to hopefully keep the conversation open for the future? What is an appropriate time frame for bringing that up again? What might you do if they ultimately
That's a good question. Yeah, well, I mean, I think one good thing is really understanding, where they're coming from, listening to what they're having to say, understanding if you were in their shoes, how you'd be viewing it. I think thanking them for considering it and letting them know that, gee, I understand right now it doesn't seem to be the right time because we are going through budget cuts or we just had layoffs or something like that. But, I feel I am doing a good job. I am working really hard. I do think I've made a lot of progress on all the goals that you've laid out for me, and I really would like to revisit this. When you could ask them, when is a reasonable time for us to revisit this, and see if you can kind of get it on the calendar or get a commitment to that. If they say, well, I'm really not sure, we're going to have to see how things go. If things are tight, or it's going to depend on this grant that we're going to get. Then see, does the grant come in or not? If the grant comes in, then you can say, well, gosh, you mentioned the grant was going to be important, or gee, we seem to have passed our budget problems now. Can we think about it? Or you can just just say that I just want to come back to you that it's really important to me. So I think it's better to give some span of time, whether it's 3 months or 6 months or longer, depending on the situation, but just let them know it's important to you and you're going to want to revisit it. A convenient time to do that is always your performance evaluation, performance review. So if you have a performance review coming up after you've had the review and after you hear what they've had to say and after they've said great things about you, and that's when you want to be able to say, oh gosh, this is really so exciting. And remember, I really appreciate your feedback and your support. I'm glad you think I'm doing a good job. Months ago, when we talked about a potential promotion or an increase, I'd like to really see it. Now might not be the time, but can we go ahead and get, remember if it's on the table. And sometimes people will just, they're not ready for it. They've got too much other stuff going on. And so don't interpret if necessarily if they put you off that they're against it. So try to understand why they're doing it, and then in a polite way ask for another time. Now, if you've tried and you've not gotten anywhere and you're really to the frustration point and the point where you need to go, then if you don't get the increase, then you need to let them know about that's the point that you're at, and so that they might take it more seriously, and they might work harder, or that you start looking for other options, and then when you have an alternative, then you can come back to them and say, I like it here. I didn't intend to be looking, but because of the salary situation, I understand your constraints. I had to look at some other options, and so I now have this other offer, and they're paying more, and I'd like to stay, or I'd like to consider staying. What can you do? So having another offer or being willing to walk away gives you the ultimate leverage.
Thanks, Jeff. Our last question is actually relevant to what we'll be covering in our next webinar on managing up. And he had a question if you could just really explain what that means. What does managing up refer to, and how is that important in compensation negotiation?
Well, so managing up is basically understanding who's above you that will be that you work with, and then secondly, who's above you that and maybe potentially them, but that will be making a decision about the decisions around compensation or promotions and those things. It's primarily finding the right way to communicate to support and be supported by your boss. Realizing that it's not a one-way street. Your boss doesn't just manage you, and managing up is being able to say, well, how do they like to communicate, and how do they, given their constraints of their job. Olivia is kind enough to work with me on having a call at 7:30 in the morning, or having a call on the way home at 6 o'clock in the evening or something, or on Saturday, because that's part of that's managing up, is knowing that I would like to get back and work sooner, but in a different time, but that's when I can squeeze it in, and it's important to the job. And and also in managing up in this case is building a really good relationship with your and integrity with your boss, so that when the time comes to ask for an increase, ask for a promotion, the relationship is there, the integrity is there, that you've done things that help them really feel good about your performance, and you've gotten feedback from them along the way, and it's not a battle, it's not a doubt. They're on your side. So you want your boss to be your advocate, either because they have the means themselves to give you the increase or the promotion, or because they will fight for you on your behalf with the human resources or the senior leaders or something like that. So managing up is helping your boss be successful, helping them see you in a successful way, and helping you also get your needs met. It's a two-way thing. Helping your boss meet your needs and understand your needs and support you, and having a good working relationship. There's a more formal definition that we can use, but that's pretty much kind of the means. So how it relates to this is what I said. It's having that relationship, so when the time comes, they're on your side, and they'll do whatever they can in a creative way, hopefully an interest-based and needs-based way, to meet your needs. Also, it's from data. It's like understand, does your boss, do they want to see the data? So like there are some people I've worked for that if I went in with the big picture and said, hey, it's time again to think about an increase, they would say, well, let's see the data and how your compensation compares to other people in the market, and how your data compares to other people's compensation. And show me the data about how you've performed relative to your targets, and how your division has performed relative to its targets. Some people want to start with, they don't want to look at the data at all. They want to start with the big picture and the relationship. And so you have to understand how your boss thinks. You want to know the Myers-Briggs that your boss has, and what their preferences are, tendencies are, and those things. And you want to organize your communication and your case for a salary increase, your case for a promotion, according to how they think and how they process things and how they make decisions. And with that, I'm going to decide that the webinar is complete for today. Hopefully you got some good information about negotiation and about compensation negotiation, and happy to try to provide additional resources. And if you have individual questions, let us know. We do have some other webinars that are already recorded that are very useful to you in a lot of ways, including your job search and networking and those kinds of things. And we will be having a webinar soon on managing up, and stay tuned. Let us know how we can best support you. Thanks to Olivia, and thanks to all of you, and good evening.